I'm going to fly fairly high and talk about ecosystem services as a metaphor and the difficulties of actually trying to apply a metaphor in practice. And I'm going to take a fairly global view. I know many of you are thinking of ecosystem services at a farm level. You have a pretty particular tract of land. You're looking out at the coastline of Lake Michigan here. And it's extremely important to be doing that sort of hands-on, particular sort of work. But I'm going to take much more of a global view and try to sort of go around the big boundaries of the local work, and then you guys bring me down to earth. Let's see which button I push here. So I'm going to have to stand back here to make sure I know which slide I'm on and look at my... One of the things about ecosystem services is the definitions are usually quite open, general, and vague. If you look at the two of these, one by Gretchen Daly, PhD in ecology, and you say, well, gee, I don't really see any ecology in that statement. It's kind of general. And then you go to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and this was a major study by thousands of scientists trying to look at ecosystem services and the state of ecosystems and their ability to deliver services. And this is a $25 million effort. And their statement also is very open. It's not really tied into the nature of ecosystems and what ecosystems do, how we understand ecosystems. And this is a serious issue. From a population biology perspective, in ecology, you can think of a stock of a population as a stock. You can think of harvesting some of that population each year. The stock will then settle in at a lower level, and you can continually, sustainably get services from that stock. So in population biology models, predator-prey models, just how do populations grow and reproduce, you can derive the concept of ecosystem services. But if you look at the rest of ecology, it doesn't quite actually tell you very much about ecological ecosystem services. And it's this disconnect between the metaphor and how we actually understand ecological systems that accounts for why we have such loose definitions of ecosystem services, and it also accounts for why we don't actually, well, we try to measure some of these ecosystem services, but usually when you try to set up a project to protect or sustain ecosystem services, you're actually saying, we'll pay you to do this land management practice, to do a practice to keep the forest in place or to not put pollutants into the water. You're not actually saying, we'll pay you for the ecosystem services that are coming out of your land. And it's that disconnect between the theory and how we understand ecosystem services that accounts for switching to this practice. The idea of using economic metaphors to describe our relationship to nature and describe the problems of development and our exploitation of nature is not a new idea. It goes way back. And here's Henry Carey, an early American economist, putting it very clearly that we're borrowing the earth and we're borrowing it from our children. We need to pass it on to our children. If we don't, nature will rebel. She'll take it back from us. It won't be there for our children. The importance of this quote and the next few quotes is the extent to which future generations are a constant issue. The whole idea of ecosystem services arises out of our concern for future generations. We're not really particularly trying to optimize and get more out of our agricultural systems. We're worried about sustaining our agricultural services so that future generations have them. So here's an agronomist, also 150 years ago or so. Labor employed in robbing the earth of its capital stock, capital, is worse than labor thrown away. And again, the reason is because future generations will bear the price. If we just threw the labor away, we'd be better off than destroying nature with it. George Perkins Marsh, very important historian of our relationship to the environment. Notice the top phrase in green, that there will soon be a perfect science that will tell us what to do. but not so soon that we cannot take action now. Because the next quote says, we cannot afford to wait till the slow and sure progress of exact science has taught us a better economy. The idea that we have to use the science we have, we can't wait for science to be perfect, is also part of what we're experiencing today. Karl Marx was also very tuned in to the biological world, to what was being discovered in the natural sciences in the 19th century, and he saw this in sort of biochemical cycles and sort of a metabolism of the earth, and urbanization was taking people off the land and concentrating them in cities, and our waste would then get concentrated in rivers instead of being going back into the land, and we're breaking a natural cycle. And in many times, Marx would bring this up as a fundamental problem. He didn't say what the answer was, but he was an observer of this transition. One of the interesting things about 19th century economists is that they're always borrowing on the natural sciences. And of course, economics has always been accused of physics envy and trying to sort of do the mathematics as if it's physics. And Karl Marx is also using the language of physics, the language of biology. He wanted to dedicate, or he thought of dedicating capital to Darwin. And it's interesting now that the natural sciences are coming to economics, sort of use the language of economics in order to explain what we need to do. Whereas in the 19th century, it was the social scientists drawing on the strength of the natural sciences. If you think about the history of how science has worked with environmental issues, our first efforts were clearly manage human waste, and this is picking up on Marx. It's the famous Broad Street well problem, the spread of cholera in London, but this then becomes a message all around the world: clean up our waste, it's making us ill. But about the same time, we also began to set land aside, especially in the United States. We have this very romantic vision of the wonderful world we live in, and it'd be a really disaster. And so scientists were very important in the establishment of the national park system, and later the national reserves, the wildlife reserves, of setting land aside. And it was very much sort of setting nature up on a pedestal and then letting the rest of the countryside being developed, farmed, turned into a disaster by industry. But at least we'd saved some virgin nature by itself. In the 1900s, we began to worry about controlling toxics in our food. Again, it's a public health concern. A lot of it is associated with Upton Sinclair, and that jungle doesn't have an L on the end of it. But that book, written about the Chicago stockyards and the treatment of labor, but also just what we were eating along with the treatment of labor, that's coming back. Our food supply is one of the strongest ways we talk to people about our relationship to the environment, because everybody understands food. By the 1960s, however, we began to change and began to less worry about ourselves. Though Rachel Carson's book is very much about pesticides in food, it's also about nature. It's about the industrialization process is destroying nature, not the nature that we've set aside in parks, but the nature in our own backyards. We're losing our songbirds, and scientists were very important in that process of saying we need to correct these problems as they're arising. Now, we did. We set up all kinds of environmental regulations in the 60s and 70s, but by the 1980s, it was clear that we couldn't just keep reacting to the problems that were being created, that we couldn't just let development take place and then react and say, oops, there's this problem, oops, there's that problem, we need to fix it here, it's constant Band-Aids, and we invented the idea of sustainable development. And sustainable development was really the idea that we have to look ahead, we have to pick technologies that aren't going to have so many problems. We need to also worry about equity. And sustainable development wasn't just a northern concept, it was a joining of the North and South, and it had very strong equity basis, a very strong equity basis. The South was saying, we need to be able to develop, the North was saying we need to have a world that's good for future generations. How are we going to get this? And for 25 years, we've been saying sustainable development, sustainable development. We haven't done very well in actually implementing sustainable development. It's been a challenge that has been far from met. And in that process, we also turn and begin to see that we are destroying ecosystems. We have the global climate change science coming on board. We begin to see the world as a world that's transforming and will continue to transform. Even if people were to leave the Earth today, the global system would continue to change for another several hundred years because of the ongoing processes that we've already put into place. And that's now our new scientific understanding. And within that, we begin to say, well, how are we going to manage ecosystems in a very rapidly changing world, while we're also worried about north-south equity and pulling this whole thing together? How are we going to get a climate accord if we don't recognize the needs of those who don't have as much as us? So we begin to think about the drivers. And the drivers are increasing rapidly. If you look at the population curve, the blue curve, it's rising rapidly. But if you look at gross world product, which is basically market activity, it's rising even more rapidly. Now, that doesn't mean there's a lot of non-market activity. In earlier times, there was subsistence activity that wasn't in gross world product. But still, human activity is increasing extremely rapidly during this period, and we don't have our arms around it. So to go back to some of these quotes and where did the idea of nature's services really start, I'm going to skip the Dust Bowl conservationists, but if you want a full environmental history, keep them in there. They were very much preachers of sort of protect nature, leave it alone. It's special, but they weren't coming to grips with our daily interactions. They really weren't coming to grips with our agriculture, with what was going on in the city. It was still worship of the wildness around us. I think, but I'm not sure, that the first really use of the term nature's services by a scientist is Walt Westman's article in Science magazine. And he starts it out with a counter quote. Though he wants to talk about nature's services, he knows he's using an economic metaphor. At the very beginning of the article, he quotes Walt Whitman and says, well, we don't really ever want to talk about nature's services just as services, because it has these other really important intrinsic values to us that we don't want to put dollar signs on. But he's going to do it. But it has this apologia right up in front of his article in Science. Investing in natural capital. The ecological economics people, the group that I guess most strongly associate with, in their 1992 conference, used this theme. And we brought ecologists and economists together, and we began to build this concept much more thoroughly. And then Gretchen Daly, Stanford University, working with a lot of ecologists and a few economists, begins to write more thoroughly about nature services. But still, there are chapters in this compilation which says, even though we need to talk in economics terms, because that's what the public understands, we need to be careful and not only talk in economics terms, because it's really offensive to an ecologist to talk about dollars and ecology. One of the most important articles, an extremely controversial article, was by ecological economist Robert Costanza and many other ecologists and economists in the journal Nature in 1997, where they took this wild idea and said, let's evaluate the total value of all of nature's services. And they come up with $33 trillion. And it totally irritates the environmental economists, probably because the ecological economists did it first. But clearly, you can't put a dollar sign. And all of nature is infinitely valuable. We could not live without nature as a whole. So how can you value as a whole? All you can do is value it on the margin and make adjustments on the margin. And yet again, they were trying to convey the idea that nature's services are extremely valuable. It's a big number. And in that, they were very successful. It's one of the most cited journal articles in the world. The term just shows up. It begins to show up in the National Research Council publications. It shows up in the idea of the ecological footprint. But the biggest advance in thinking of ecosystem services is really with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that starts out at the beginning of this millennium and is completed by 2005. But in the 2003 framework document, they lay out saying, we are going to assess the literature on sort of the state of ecosystems and the relationships between ecosystems and ecosystem services and people's activities systematically with ecologists, economists, other social scientists involved. And they come out with a massive volume where ecosystem services get laid out in great detail as provisioning services, regulating services, and cultural services. And here's what they contribute to people. And then behind that, there are supporting services within the ecosystem. There are services within the ecosystem that serve the provisioning, the regulating, and the cultural services. And so they laid out this idea of ecosystem services in great detail and then put it into a systems diagram. So now, this is the whole human story. You've got human well-being in the upper left-hand corner. You basically have ecosystems in the lower left-hand corner. Human activity in the upper left-hand corner results in drivers that then are indirect drivers that then have direct drivers to ecosystems, which then change the ecosystems, change the services that are available, and then affect human well-being. And so it's a total system. And they also see it as a regional level problem, a local level problem, and a global problem. This issue of scales, or what scale are we working at, was a very big problem in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Whereas climate change is really a global problem. It doesn't matter where the greenhouse gases go up from, we're all affected. But in ecosystems, everything is local, and yet it's also regional, and there are global phenomena affecting ecosystem change as well. So this assessment was much more complicated. One of the things we did, and I was very engaged in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, was just try to illustrate what was going on by the intensity of the speed up of the drivers. Okay? If the drivers are really speeding up very fast, then what are we going to do? Whereas a lot of the issues with ecosystem services is sort of how do we balance on the margin? How do we pick the right level of ecosystem services on the margin? But if you're in a system that's being driven by rapidly changing driving forces, rapidly increasing driving forces, then maybe analysis on the margin is a little bit tricky. And this is exactly what the National Research Council report also says. In 2005, independently of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, they say, yes, you can measure ecological services, ecosystem services, but it's very specific. It's very case-specific, and yet there's these driving factors at other scales which make it difficult to work at the local scale as well. But they're very wary in this study of saying you can take a measure of ecosystem services in Illinois and a piece of prairie in Illinois and transfer that to a piece of prairie somewhere else. And yet, that's what we do all of the time. The Millennium Assessment comes out with analyses. These are the best results we have. No significant figures. It drives me crazy when the physicists do their studies of climate change and keep presenting the results with multiple significant figures, and yet they know their studies of climate change don't have ecological feedbacks in them yet. And as they get ecological feedbacks into their climate models, which they haven't been able to do over the last decade, the uncertainties are just going to increase dramatically. In the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, we do everything in a very qualitative way because we basically came out with a conclusion that we're dealing with very complex systems, and we better address it in a very qualitative way. So the color of the squares represent the intensity of the change over the last 50 years. The direction of the arrows represent the intensity of the force over the next 50 years. And it all looks bad except for temperate habitat, forest habitat change. There's a major study or a major effort underway reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And this also is very ecosystem service driven in its framework. It's basically trying to stabilize deforestation and forest degradation so that we can have ecosystem service markets so that we can actually trade carbon from north to south so that people in the north can burn carbon and say, but it's offset by sequestration in forests in tropical areas where trees grow faster. But to have such markets, you really need to stabilize and have a baseline of what's happening in the tropics. And in the tropics, we've just had this long history of, well, we did it sooner, but the story of the 19th century in the tropics is immense deforestation, and it's still going on. And how are we going to set up some sort of market for ecosystem services if you're in a world of rapid change? And this project is a massive effort, if it actually comes to fruition, to provide some stabilization in the system so that then we can then think about managing ecosystem services. I was very involved in a 3-year study, 10, 12 authors, on the ecological debt of nations. And here we violated all the rules of the National Research Council. We extrapolated estimates of values of ecosystem services from one country to the next. We extrapolated ecological change from one area to the next. But we tried to look at rich nations, middle-income nations, and poor nations, and the extent they were, in effect, hurting themselves by degrading their ecosystems, and the extent to which other income categories of nations were affecting their ecosystems. And so these footprints represent that the rich nations in red have a really big footprint on the low and middle income countries, while the poor nations, the yellow footprint, has almost no footprint at all on the middle income and rich nations. And that the ecological debt, and this is just a 40-year period of debt, 1961 to 2000, is comparable, if not considerably larger than economic debt, but in the other direction. The World Bank has incorporated ecosystem services in its thinking, and it's becoming the major way in the environment program of the World Bank and in many environmental agencies, many development agencies, for them to think about environment and development. And so ecosystem services has just become the language of how do we work with environment and development. And this is a phenomenon of the last 5 or 6 years. I'm also involved in the European effort to look at the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. Again, heavily ecosystem services based. So the concept, this metaphor, has just taken off. The metaphor is everywhere. This is now how we think. So it's been an incredible success. Incredible success. And yet I'm going to become a little critical. I'm going to try to go around the edges and say, is it really as good as we'd like it to be? And I'm going to do this by first dealing with the economics. And generally, economics is practiced in an efficiency framework. It's its strongest card. Its strongest suit is talking about efficiency, to sort of say, do we have the benefits and the costs suggest that this is what we ought to do, and the marginal benefits and the marginal costs suggest here's what the level we ought to be doing it at. And in the economic framework, this graph says, if you look at level of ecosystem services available to the current generations and level of ecosystem services available to future generations, if we use a lot of ecosystem services, we'll be degrading the stock of ecosystems, and future generations will have less. So the intensity at which we use ecosystem services, we can use a lot of ecosystem services by exploiting the stock and leave less for future generations. Every point on the blue line, does the blue line show up for you guys? Just barely. Every one of those points is an efficient point. And basically what economics says is that if you're at A, you want to move out to that efficiency frontier where current generations and future generations are better off. You could move way to the southwest, or southeast, I'm sorry, and just make the current generation better off also. But underlying, we have this gut feeling that we ought to be doing this to make future generations better off. So you're internalizing externalities. You're making the market system more efficient by going from A to B. Okay? But there's also sustainability. And we can express sustainability in economics also. And sustainability is, as defined by the Brundtland Commission, is basically living in the current in a manner where future generations are not hurt, so that there's as much available for future generations as we have for ourselves today. And that would be represented by the 45-degree line. And basically, we want to be on or above the 45-degree line. And we'd prefer to be efficient, which would put you on the blue line. So sustainability is about being on the blue line above that 45-degree line. That's where future generations are as well off as we are. And that means we really need to think about what does sustainability mean. That just putting ecosystem services into the market is not enough to assure sustainability. That will just assure efficiency, or at least will get us towards efficiency. But sustainability is a macro concept where you really have to worry about future generations. Now, admittedly, we have a concept of strong sustainability and weak sustainability. And strong sustainability says we want to actually have the same level or more ecosystem services for future generations, whereas weak sustainability says we can exploit ecosystems and leave fewer ecosystem services for future generations as long as we leave them with more physical capital, more human capital, more institutional capital, some other things that makes their life good. And I've put the diagrams in terms of strong sustainability, but still, the issue of are we working with ecosystems and thinking about the economics of ecosystems in a sustainable way, or are we just trying to improve efficiency? Those are different matters. There's a third thing. I'm going to call it inconvenient truth after Al Gore's famous book and movie. And this is basically that over the last 15 years, there's a lot of evidence that we have fooled ourselves, that the trade-off between current generations and future generations doesn't look like the upper blue line, but maybe it looks like the lower blue line. Okay? Now, maybe I've exaggerated. Maybe climate change isn't that damaging, though if we did enough of it, could be. But if you had climate change, ecosystem transformation, all the problems that we face, many environmentalists will say, this is really a different world we're in. And we're not really trying to reach B, we need to go to C. And C means current generations have to give up something. We have to use less ecosystem services. We need to rebuild the stock of ecological services so that future generations have more. We've already depleted this ecosystem services more than we should have, and we need to build up the stock. And to do that, current generations have to consume less. And that immediately brings back, well, who? Okay? And of course, the US Senate thought it ought to be China and India, equal with us. But I think by most criteria, people would say, no, those of us who've enjoyed the benefits of exploiting ecosystems over the last 100 years probably have more responsibility to rebuild ecosystems than the poor people of China and India. And though we need to do as much as we can to help them not destroy their ecosystems, that argument of the footprints of who's stepping on whom of the article that we published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences is very much at play. And so when we think about the economics of ecosystem services, we really need to think, are we just doing the right thing within some narrow context, and thinking that's enough, or are we really also making sure that we're making the big fight about sustainability, and are we also making sure we really understand the nature of the world in terms of the damages we've done and what it means for future generations? And I think all three of those need to be brought into play. And in general, we haven't been doing that. Okay, so I already said, but this brings us back to this picture. So most of ecosystem services has really been thinking about ecosystem services has really been on the left-hand side. Let's try to think of them in market terms. Let's try to internalize the externality. Let's try to make the system more efficient. And we also need to think about sustainability. And then we also need to worry, have we really damaged the world so much that future generations are going to be substantially worse off? Or do we really have other technologies which are more than enough to compensate, but perhaps or probably some compensation is due? We're not going to get a global climate change accord if we don't acknowledge that. I want to move to the epistemological problems. Okay? And going back to that quote in green from George Perkins Marsh 150 years ago, someday the sciences will get everything together. We'll have this perfect knowledge and it'll all be coherent. And that idea that we'll unify the sciences and everything will somehow pop into place and we'll understand the natural world out there is still the hope. The physicists are still trying to unify physics. E.O. Wilson now wants to add not only physics, but all of ecology and sociology and economics into his worldview and unify everything. The Enlightenment hope that we can understand the whole system is alive in the view of science. But the facts are we have highly fragmented science, and that's where we are today. And yet the hope that it'll all come together frequently says, oh, we've got problems, let's go back to the laboratory, let's go back to the theory, let's go back and study this more. We need more money to do our research so that we get to the state of seeing the whole piece, a God's eye view of the natural mess we're in, and then we'll fix it. That hope is an excuse for inaction frequently, and it's also a little difficult for me to understand. Because maybe all of our knowledge is already whole. Maybe here at the University of Chicago, in all the different professors' minds, and all the books in the libraries, all of it fits together already. It's just highly distributed between dead minds and live minds. Okay? But it all fits. But who would know? But maybe it does. And so the only way you can fit it together is by talking, getting it together. We're not going to come up with an Einstein squared mind that's going to see it all and absorb it all. We are social creatures. But this vision of it all unifying is a vision of the individual scientist having a God's eye view. Forget it, please. Okay? It's a major problem. And it shows up. Okay? As we go about doing the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, we had this perfect model, a really good model, that we were going to do the assessment of the literature. That's the job of these collective efforts. You get all the 1,400 ecologists and economists and other social scientists together. You all do your reading. You all try to break it out into parts. And you come together and meet and try to put it together. And it doesn't come together for at least 6 reasons. And I'd like to go through each of those. Our knowledge is fractured. The social scientists were doing their social science without putting ecological services, ecosystem services into their thinking. So as we assess the literature for what do the social scientists tell us as we try to fit it into that big ecosystem model, the linkages aren't there. The arrows between stuff aren't there in the social science literature. Similarly, ecologists hate people. They'd love to go into the middle of the Amazon where they imagined the Indians never were. And, of course, they were. And there are theories as to how indigenous peoples might have actually affected the diversity of life in the Amazon. But by and large, ecologists prefer not to study farms. They prefer to go out in undisturbed nature. That's the nature of natural science, that there is a natural world out there apart from us. And I'm sure there was one time, but there hasn't been for a long time. And so the natural sciences are really unsocial sciences, and the social sciences are really unnatural sciences. And then those problems occur within each other. One of the most wonderful things is that the natural scientists actually see people in their work. The Millennium Assessment was actually instigated by conservation biologists. The conservation biologists have long worked in developing countries. They've already been accused of being ecological imperialists. They've already dealt with all kinds of trouble in the sort of the cultural barriers. And they could drink beer with social scientists, and they had, but they had to publish their articles in natural science journals, so what they publish has less knowledge than they actually had. And that's true of the social scientists, too. When we publish, we have to publish in our disciplinary journals, but fortunately, we, too, drink beer with natural scientists. We go out and we see the world. We see what's happening. And so we have a lot of scientific knowledge that we've shared and a lot of experiential knowledge. And it was really that which allowed us to come across the barrier of the fractured and get the report out. Multiple ecological frameworks in ecology. There's organismal ecology, population biology, food webs, energetics, hierarchy theory, evolutionary ecology, behavioral ecology, landscape ecology, biogeochemical cycles. There are more. I've got landscape. There are more. They don't all fit together. There's no meta-model in ecology. And different ecologists prefer to work in one way or another, but they talk to each other. Okay? But that's how they cross their knowledges, is by talking to each other. So with all these different ways that we understand ecosystems, the ecosystem service one really fits best with the population biology model. And only that. There's the incongruent temporal and spatial scales. And here we have another famous ecologist, and I dare say brighter than, he doesn't hold the hope of E.O. Wilson. He doesn't hold the hope of unified knowledge. He says, the dynamics of ecological systems take place on many different scales simultaneously, and the great challenges for us are to understand how processes change across scales, how our perspectives on systems affects the dynamics that we see, and how processes on one scale relate to processes on other scales. Extremely important statement. And notice, in his words as an ecologist, he says, how our perspectives on systems. Okay? Because he knows that ecologists see systems in different ways, and it's we who see. That would be postmodern, except we couldn't say that to him. Well, I think he might accept that. He might accept that. Okay? So this is the world in which we live in. The same things are happening at the social level. The same things happen at the economic level. On the one hand, we have things that are local economics, but it's all global at the same time. Contextuality and historical contingencies, I think I'll move faster on that. Aggregation difficulties were important. We actually, in the Millennium Assessment, had great difficulty talking in sort of systemic terms because everything was particular. And one way of aggregating things, in climate change you have greenhouse gases that you can sort of say, here's their rough equivalent. Here's the equivalent of methane to carbon dioxide in a 100-year time period. In 25 years they would be equivalent in different ways, but at least they could come to ways of aggregating greenhouse gases. As we tried to think about ecosystem services and the driving forces that were changing them, we couldn't aggregate anything. And one way is that was suggested, well, why don't we use dollar values? And the economists from the South said, no way, because eco-tourist dollars are the same as the dollars of the peasant who has to get his goods to market. And that's not fair. That's not fair. Okay. Everybody knows that ecologists know all about thresholds, except that they don't. There's never been agreement as to when a population would crash. There's certainly been some ecologists say this fishery is about to crash, and there's been another ecologist say, well, actually, I think it's at a state where it's about to pick up, and the driving forces of driving the crash are less, and it's not going to crash. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But ecologists, the concept of thresholds and the idea of a population crashing or an ecosystem going from one state into another state, crossing some sort of a threshold that it can't go back over, is very important in ecology, very important the way we think about our relationship with nature, and that we don't want to drive over these thresholds, or if we do, we want to know where they are and want to do it deliberately. And yet, ecologists can't say what they are, because not that they don't exist, but there are many, 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 many such thresholds, depending on conditions. So, the state of our ecological knowledge, and I'll say the state of our social science knowledge, is highly problematic for sort of reducing everything to the idea of an ecosystem service. And the way we get over this is through collective cognition. That we really need to get together and do these things as teams. We need to work with many people. We need to bring the stakeholders into the process. We need to think of who might be the future actors in this system and how they're going to be looking at what needs are. And yet we have this vision of science being an individual activity when it has to be a collective activity. Okay, I want to go to the institutional issues, and I'll try to move along. The development itself has only been a partial success. Sustainable development has even been less successful. We've had very little success at really instigating sustainable development. And we are desperately in need of an adequate global accord to bring climate change under control so that we can, at least slow down the rate of change of ecological systems and begin to manage them and work with them. And until we really get these big institutions in place, then what we do at the local level can not be helpful, except that we can maybe garner the experience. We can use our local experiences to say, this is a really interesting, complex problem, but now I see I have to think at the regional level. And as you think at the regional level, you then say, I have to work at the global. We need to get it all together. But there are definitely people in the payments for ecosystem services game who are saying, well, somebody else is going to have to worry about those bigger, broader issues. We can make it work as we can make it work. And there's some who say, well, actually, payments for ecosystem services is going to be such a phenomenal driving force of change that if we can just get it in place, then everything else will get into place. And you get all these diversities of opinion and how it's going to work. And, I've read papers where payments for ecosystem services is just not about equity. And yet we're busily in the process of putting payments for ecosystem services into place, establishing rights. And we should be worrying about who is actually getting those rights and how it affects the distribution of income, because we have a larger problem of the distribution of income that we need to overcome. So how do we both work at this local level and work at the regional level and work at the global level and sort of learn how to get it all together? And I think that's what the challenge is. We're now in a system that is also challenged by rapid ecological change. And I've said this before, I'll say it again. We are not in the world that I grew up in. It is a world that is changing faster than before. So what do? And basically, the metaphor of ecosystem services is extremely important. It is where we are at It's how we're now trying to understand our relationship with nature. But we need to work with it and work with it at all these different levels and somehow tackle it all together. That if we just say, if we solve our ecosystem service problem, work on this field, work on that field, it'll be good experience, but it won't be the answer until we get all the bigger questions worked out too. I'm going to stop there. Okay, so put it all down, and I'm ready for questions.